The report speech is the grammar that we use if we want to tell another person something in our own words about a conversation that took place in the past. We can use it in two ways, direct speech and indirect speech. The direct speech is used to explicitly quote what the other person said. In this case, that person's word must be enclosed in quotation marks. The structure is the next one. Subject plus verb said or told plus quotation mark plus direct speech plus quotation mark. For example, Carl said, "I will call you." In indirect speech, quotation marks aren't necessary, as what the other person said is not conveyed literally. Its structure is characterized because you use the pronoun that to introduce what that other person said, like this. William said that you bought a house. I mentioned some rules that are very useful to be able to use. The verb tense changes from the present to the past.
For example, in the direct speech for the present simple, we will say, "I am very glad to see you again," Miguel said. And for the indirect speech, it will be, "Miguel said that they was glad to see me again." In the direct speech for the present continuous, we will say, "Sabrina is working in Buenos Aires," he said. And for the indirect speech, it will be, "He said Sabrina was working in Buenos Aires." In the direct speech for the past simple, we will say, "Did you finish the test?" she asked me. And for the indirect speech, it will be, "She asked me if I had finished the test." In the direct speech for the past continuous, we will say, "They said we weren't going to cinema today." And for the indirect speech, it will be, "They said that they hadn't going to cinema today." In the direct speech for the present perfect simple, we will say, "Mario said, I've already gone out." And for the indirect speech, it will be, "Mario told me that he'd already gone out." In the direct speech for the present perfect continuous, we will say, "I've been playing piano for 10 years, she said." And for the indirect speech, it will be, "She said that she'd been playing piano for 10 years.
For the past simple and for the past continuous, the verbs will remain the same.
For example, in past perfect simple for the direct speech, we will say, "I'd been to my home before the college," he said. And for indirect speech, it will be, "She said that she'd been her home before the college." In past perfect continuous for the direct speech, we will say, "He said, I'd been working here for years before quit." And for indirect speech, it will be, "He said that he'd been working here for years before quit."
Modal verb tenses also change once you go from direct to indirect style.
In direct speech, we use will, and in indirect speech will be would. In direct speech, we use can, and in indirect speech will be could. In direct speech, we use must, and in indirect speech will be had to. In direct speech, we use shall, and in indirect speech will be should. In direct speech, we use may, and in indirect speech will be might.
Adverbial phrases of time also undergo change.
For example, in direct speech, we say today, and in indirect speech, it changed to that day. In direct speech, we say this week, and in indirect speech, it changed to that week. In direct speech, we say tomorrow, and in indirect speech, it changed to the next day. In direct speech, we say next month, and in indirect speech, it changed to the following month. In direct speech, we say yesterday, and in indirect speech it changed to the day before. In direct speech we say last year, and in indirect speech it changed to the previous year. In direct speech we say now, and in indirect speech it changed to at that moment. In direct speech we say here, and in indirect speech it changed to there. For example, in direct speech we will say, the secretary said Mr. Phillips is leaving the office now, and in indirect speech it will be, the secretary said Mr. Phillips was
Finally,
leaving the
as
office
with
at
verbs,
that moment.
we must also bear in mind that when passing the sentences to indirect still, the personal or possessive pronoun agrees.
For example, for the following sentences in direct speech, we will say, Ryan told me I'm in a bit of a rush. And for indirect speech, we will say,